Hey, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 2022 Black Landscapes Matter Speaker Series. My name is Robin Wright Pierce, and I am excited to be your moderator and your host for tonight's important and captivating conversation. For those who don't know, the Black Landscapes Matter Speaker Series is an initiative of the Black Environmental Leaders Association, which is an amazing organization, an association of Black environmentalists who are working together to help bring forward environmental justice in our built environment and in the natural environment. And so for this speaker series, we have been traveling virtually across the state of Ohio, having conversations with activists, with community leaders, and with environmental practitioners to really investigate and understand the connection between our built environment. So the things that we as people are doing to our environment, the structures, the landscapes that we are creating, whether it is in our housing or how we are using the natural resources. So we're exploring the connection between those things and racial justice. And so we've been traveling and hearing from folks across the state to have this very important series of conversations. And I am so excited for tonight's conversation. These conversations have been broadening the discourse and conversations about how these things are connected. We know that where we live and how we live in relationship to our environment is instrumental to our health and our well-being. And we know also that because of systemic racism and inequality in our society, that the disparate impact of injustices in our environment are not felt equally by all. And so we have these conversations to just broaden the discourse so that we can elevate how race plays a role in this and what we can do about it, importantly. And so today's conversation is really exciting. We're going to be talking about water. So we know that water plays an important role in all of our lives. Just like every other species on this planet nearly, we need water to survive. We are heavily reliant on access to clean, affordable, and plentiful water. We see the effects of not having access to water when we look on the West Coast and what's happening with the droughts out west and how they are rationing water on the West Coast. We see how our decision-making and policies impact water quality when we think about what has happened in Flint, Michigan, for instance, right? And they're still struggling to this day with water equity and justice. And so this is an important conversation that affects even those of us who are surrounded by the Great Lakes and the rivers, and like us here in Ohio, and surrounded by water. How we make decisions and use that water and how we treat that water impacts our lives. And so I'm excited to have this conversation today. And specifically about water, we're going to be talking about algae and agricultural runoff. What are they? How do they affect us? Why should we care about them? And what can we do to help preserve the quality of our water here in Ohio and in our neighboring states around us? And so I'm so excited for our panel because we have an amazing set of folks here for this conversation. And I know those who watch this series have heard me say this every single month. And if you've seen this every month, you've also seen that I'm not lying. We have an amazing group of panelists tonight with us. And so I'm excited to introduce our four panelists. First up, we have Elena Statue, who is a biomimicry PhD fellow. That's a whole mouthful, I know. Biomimicry. I had to Google it and I'm now fascinated by it. And I'm in a little bit of regret that I didn't get a degree in biomimicry, because why not? It's amazing. So she's a biomimicry PhD fellow from the University of Akron, which I won't hold against her. I went to Kent State, but that's okay. She currently works with Biohabitats, the Cleveland Water Alliance in the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, where she's exploring how to stabilize and restore coastal regions across the Great Lakes. So for those who don't know, like I didn't know what biomimicry is, it's a practice that's really about learning from and mimicking strategies found in nature to help solve complex human challenges. So in other words, she's analyzing nature to inform inform possible solutions to environmental challenges we face today. So all the Black folks watching this know that that's what we've been doing, right, for generations, learning from nature how we can live in concert with our habitat and how we can solve our problems. And so I'm excited to hear her unique perspective. Thank you, Elena, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I'm also excited about the next panelist I'm going to introduce, Dr. Reuter. Dr. Jeff Reuter is a retired professor from my alma mater, The Ohio State University. And there he did everything. He directed the Ohio Sea Grant, the Stone Laboratory, the Center for Lake Erie Area Research, known as CLEAR, and the Great Lakes Aquatic Ecosystem Research Consortium, among a number of other things. So in other words, this man knows a lot about water. So thank you, Dr. Reuter, for being here. You're muted.
Thanks for the invitation, Robin. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Awesome. And so I also want to introduce our next panelist, Takoya Brown. So we're not going to hold this against her, but she's coming to us from Kentucky, from the Division of Water, which is really working to protect and manage and enhance the quality and quantity of water for its citizens. Takoya works there, and she centers her work on ensuring access to quality drinking water. And so I'm super excited about the work she's doing and has been doing over the years to help ensure that we have access to drinking water. Thank you, Takoya, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And then last and certainly not least is Jasmine Henderson. So you all, if you've watched a few of these conversations, you've seen Jasmine's face. She's also hosting another series of conversations with the Black Environmental Leaders Association. Jasmine is a community organizer and an environmentalist with BEL. And she comes to us from Dayton, Ohio. And she's been with us for several conversations in the past. And I know from those conversations that she is a wise sister with a lot of great things to say and a complete, brilliant activist who's doing amazing work in the Dayton area. And so, Jasmine, I'm so happy that you are with us today.
Well, thank you for that big up, because I needed it today. But yeah, that was amazing, and I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. We all need it. It's been a lot of trying weeks. And so I don't know about you all, but I've needed these moments of inspiration. I had my sister text me pictures of my 9-month-old niece just so that I could have something to smile at a moment ago. So I feel it. So let's jump into this conversation. So I want to start this conversation by laying a strong foundation for our viewers. There may be some folks here who are watching this and wondering, like, what is algae, right? And what do we mean by agricultural runoff? And what does this have to do with me and my life? And so if we can, I want to start by taking a moment to define for our viewers these two terms and exploring the relationship between the two. And so, Dr. Reuter, I want to start with you because you just have so much experience in this area. How would you describe for our listeners what algae is, what agricultural runoff is, and what the relationship is between the two?
Well, Robin, I think there's several key points to quickly understand here. First, algae, think of, for the purposes of this discussion, let's think of them as being single-celled or colonial plants that are primarily aquatic and they do not have roots. Some attach to surfaces, and you probably have all seen green stuff attaching to the inside of the glass of your aquarium or the siding on your house or your roof. But most of the algae are planktonic, and that means that they are floating or drifting in the water. And those are different species than what we see attached to our roofs or attached to the inside of our aquarium. They're drifting around, that's what planktonic means. They contain a number of different pigments or colors, and they grow by producing oxygen in the presence of sunlight by a process called photosynthesis. About half of all the oxygen that we breathe comes from the algae. These algae, if we give them the right fertilizers, think of it that way, we can get very large masses of algae, and we call those algae blooms. In the summer, during real warm weather, we tend to get a form of algae called blue-green algae, or more accurately, cyanobacteria. And they're capable of producing toxins, and those are more toxic than cyanide, very toxic. We call those harmful algal blooms because they're capable of producing the toxins. Now, runoff, we get runoff from our yards, from roads, parking lots, roofs, sidewalks, and agricultural fields when it rains. A light rain tends to give very little runoff because it tends to sink into the ground or it sinks into your yard. But heavy rains produce a lot of runoff. Runoff from agricultural fields is agricultural runoff, and it carries soil, manure from animals, and fertilizer with it. Your primary nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, are in that runoff, and they make algae grow, just the same way fertilizer makes your grass grow on your lawn. In fresh water, phosphorus is almost always what we call the limiting nutrient. And that simply means that the algae stop growing when all the phosphorus is used up. Therefore, the more phosphorus we give the algae, the bigger the population gets, or the bigger that bloom can get. In Lake Erie and most problem spots in Ohio, agricultural runoff's the dominant source of phosphorus. For example, the Maumee River at Toledo is the largest tributary to the Great Lakes. It brings in most of the phosphorus to Lake Erie, and it drains 4 million acres of agricultural land. But it also carries with it sewage discharges from Toledo, Fort Wayne, Findlay, Lima, Defiance, and a number of other cities up in Northwest Ohio. But when we look at the total amount of phosphorus that's in that river, over 85% of it is coming to Lake Erie from agricultural runoff. So it's really runoff from a rainstorm, a rain event from agricultural land carrying phosphorus that causes harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie and many other places around Ohio.
That's interesting. So thank you for that background. So I'm curious. So it sounds like the agricultural runoff is leading to the harmful algae blooms that you were describing. So what have you noticed in terms of your research and your work is the actual impact of those algae blooms, and also how big of an issue is this?
Well, this is a real big issue. And in many ways, it's a return of an issue. We had these same problems in the 60s and 70s when I first started working on Lake Erie. But in those days, the primary source of the phosphorus was poor sewage treatment. So we improved sewage treatment, reduced the amount of phosphorus going into the lake, and the lake responded by becoming the walleye capital of the world. The amount of phosphorus that's been going into the lake now has been increasing since the mid-90s. The harmful algal blooms in the lake are now large enough that since 2002, we've been measuring them from space with satellites. These harmful algal blooms occur every year. They're found in every state. It's not just an Ohio issue. In fact, when we look around the country now, 40% of all the lakes and ponds in the United States have too much phosphorus, and more than 35% have too much nitrogen. Wow. There's 4 primary toxins that are produced by the algae. Lake Erie has all 4 of them. Saxitoxin, one of the toxins, is actually a terrorism agent. Microcystin, the most toxic of the 4, is now detected in 39% of all US lakes and ponds. The problem's getting worse. Ohio EPA in Ohio has found saxitoxin, that terrorism agent, in over 25% of all the surface water drinking sources. It caused the Toledo water crisis in 2014, where the toxins were in the drinking water. And for 55 hours, everyone in Toledo was told that they couldn't drink the water, couldn't bathe with it, really shouldn't be touching it. Human health problems caused by the algal toxins, neurological problems, rashes, breathing issues, kidney and liver problems, intestinal problems. We see an increased incidence of non-alcoholic liver cancer wherever harmful algal blooms occur, such as Toledo and Lake Okeechobee in Florida. There's early evidence of links to ALS, Parkinson's, and Alzheimer's. And we can detect, when you think about, you have a harmful algal bloom on a lake, and the wind's blowing, you get a little bit of wave action. You tend to get a little bit of a spray from the waves, and we can carry these toxins over a mile inland. So there's, I mean, the impacts are very, very significant.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like it. So, Elena, I want to bring you into this conversation as well, because you've been doing a lot of work in your fellowship recently, in the Lake region. And so I would love to hear from you. What are you noticing in terms of the prevalence of this and how it's showing up and its impact in our society?
Yeah, so I look at a slightly different issue, and you mentioned this in the intro. I look at coastal stabilization and restoration, but it does have cascading impacts for water quality. So to give an example, so when you go to Lake Erie, you often tend to see like piles of rock, which are known as riprap. Or you might see like steel walls or timber walls or concrete walls. And well, that's what's called shoreline hardening. And we do that typically with concrete, rock, and steel because we are wanting to prevent erosion, both from wave action or storm surge, or as well as landward erosion, because a lot of our businesses or homes or even farms are located really close, directly close to the shoreline. And so we want to, preserve that property. The issue with that is you disrupt that land to water interface, which is extremely important for nutrient cycling. So oftentimes you have a lot of transitional like aquatic plants. You can think of like coastal wetlands or marshes, swamp-like areas. And those areas are key for cycling, say, nitrogen and phosphorus and decomposing those in a way that they, don't end up out throughout Lake Erie. And it's also great habitat for fish nursery, for bird migrations, bird nurseries, overall swamps, marshes, wetlands. I love them because they're like some of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And so when you continue to cut off the land from the water, you disrupt the possibility of a habitat like forming or occurring or being able to sustain itself there. You disrupt that nutrient cycling and other key processes. But what also happens is, depending on what kind of infrastructure you put in place, sometimes, say, if you have a wall and you have a wave hitting that wall, the wave will hit it and reflect back. Just like, if anything sort of splashes on a surface, it's going to reflect back. And what it tends to do is it hits that wall, it orients downward due to gravity. And what it will do is scour or like carve out the bottom. And so you get your near shore becomes deeper. So you have deeper water levels. And then that means the wave heights are larger because you have deeper water, your waves can now be higher. And so the infrastructure you put in place can now no longer handle those wave heights because it's deep into that water. And then if you think about how you're scouring it, you're churning up sediment. And so we've seen, if you drive past Lake Erie, there's days where it's gorgeous and it's blue. And then usually after a heavy rain event, it's kind of brown. A lot of the times it's like a brownish color. And that's often because there's a lot of sediment, both coming from the rivers like Maumee River, Cuyahoga River, Chagrin River, just sediment washing into the lake, but also just from that churning and that scouring that's occurring at the shoreline. And that, turbid water causes, the water to be warmer. That can allow for algal blooms to like thrive longer, like those warmer, cloudy temperatures. Some of those species just thrive better. Our native species can't adapt to that water as well because they're cold, glacially adapted species. Our Great Lakes were formed by glaciers. So that warm, cloudy water is not something they've been adapted to. So I look at shoreline hardening, but you can see from just my description, it's like cascades into a variety, it cascades into water quality, both with sediment and algae blooms, as well as just like habitat for other creatures to exist, right? And even our own access to the water.
It sounds like we need to have a whole second series just on just on that. It also has me thinking, like, why is the Ohio River always brown? At least y'all get blue days up there in Lake Erie. Yeah, so this is great. This is a great conversation. So I want to bring Jasmine and Sequoia into this conversation because Dr. Reuter sort of hinted toward it and started down this path of thinking about the drinking water, right? And like the impact of those toxins on the drinking water. And Elena sort of talked about how what we're doing, right, that built environment that we're creating around the lakes is actually exacerbating in some ways, not just the algae blooms, but a whole host of other challenges to the water and to the ecosystem around our waterways. And so I want to bring you two in. Jasmine, I'm going to start with you, and then Sequoia, you can chime in. And thinking about access to quality drinking water. And so when we think about this, what is the impact of this on the everyday person? What are you seeing in your work? And how is this impacting our communities?
Yes, thank you, Robin. And also, thank you, Elena, and thank you, Dr. Reuter, for having a thorough and giving a comprehensive conversation around that. And I would just like also to state, like, the Great Lakes had to be declared like a person in order to get certain protections. Like, that's currently where we are in water. So I just wanted to throw that out there to give context, like that we had to go to court to make sure that, like, the Great Lakes don't catch on fire again, which is why the EPA was started when Dr. Reuter began his career. And so to round that all out, I live in the southwest part of Ohio, so a bit warmer, naturally, still formed by the same glaciers, but it was more so of a sea, a warmer sea down here, which led to tributaries that gave rise to the Ohio River, which thus goes into the southern part of the United States. So we have slightly different water issues when we're here because our reservoirs are different down here. And in particularly Dayton, Ohio, we have what we call an aquifer. An aquifer is usually a self-sustained, self-filling filtration system that is located deep within the earth, but not too deep. So you're able to drill it, which is actually ideal for agricultural spaces like Ohio, but particularly for the southwest part of Ohio. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people came to this region because of where the Great Miami River is located, which has 3 smaller tributaries, and also because of our access to this wonderful aquifer. So for many, many years, Southwest Ohio, particularly Dayton, was considered a gem for drinking water quality. And that is because we have a self-sustaining aquifer that pretty much did most of our job in the filtration system because we had rocks and gravel and so many things that make up the top part of an aquifer that filters out the water. But over time, the agricultural runoff, but also because in this part of Ohio, we have a lot of manufacturing waste because we do live in the Rust Belt, and the Rust Belt unfortunately is dying. So we have a lot of improper chemical dumping that has been linked to a number of things that have significantly impacted our aquifer and set up our aquifer to fight things that we have never had to fight before, right? So this aquifer isn't designed to get out certain pesticides that have nitrates in them and certain complex chemicals like CAs, I believe is what they're called, that are linked to cancers that were found in our aquifer. So now we're facing that issue also with the capturing and the aging of our sewage systems. So the way the water is captured and cleaned in Ohio, we really don't replenish our aquifer more, but we continue to take out water in disproportionate rates with the few large manufacturers that we do have here, like the military base and like other businesses. I ain't gonna put their business out there, that operates and does business in Dayton, right? So when all of this comes together, you have an aquifer system that is being used faster than it is being replenished. And when it is being replenished, it's being replenished with things that it naturally cannot filter out that are actually linked to cancer and different things like that. And then when you cycle that water out of the aquifer into our older homes, like my home will be 100 years old. I live across the street from the oldest home in our neighborhood, which is 120 years old. We often have lead pipes, right? So all these new chemicals that our aquifer was not made to build, it was not made to filter through naturally because of how it was created and how it was designed. But also the manufacturing runoff from the businesses, from the military base, and then you filtering through lead pipes. These chemicals are actually leaching out more of the lead, which is actually creating a Flint 2.0 problem in places like Dayton. And we have to understand that this is not unique to Dayton. This is overwhelmingly common in areas like everywhere in Ohio, right? And at the same time, since we're not filling our aquifer system the way we should be, because we're taking so fast, it's at risk of collapsing, right? Because there's only so much sediment and things which are soft soil, because it's designed for the water to filter through it. So that's what we're particularly dealing with in Dayton, Ohio, that is linked to things like cancer, that is linked to things like higher lead. And also when she talked about that soil nutrient thing, that is very important for places like here, because that algae, the healthy type, that don't necessarily lead to the plumes, actually sit on top of the aquifers in our first step, infiltration. So I just thought I'd say that.
Goodness. And that's wow. Firstly, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for just the vast knowledge you just shared, because what you're saying, I can see already, right, the natural connection between how this is impacting communities, right? How this is impacting the everyday person, whether we're talking about the quality of the Great Lakes, whether we're talking about the quality and the sustainability of the reservoirs in the Southwest Ohio region, right? And as I'm listening to that, I'm hearing undertones of what I'm reading is happening on the West Coast, right? The water is being used at a much higher rate than it's being replenished, right? And in your case, what you're talking about is even when it's replenished, the quality, right, is questionable, and the ability of our infrastructure to actually filter through some of the things that are actually being dumped into the water, right? And so, Takoy, I want to bring you in because a lot of your work centers on quality drinking water. And so I would love to hear from your vantage point, what are you noticing? What are some of the challenges around this issue for you all?
Well, I first want to talk about polluted water. Water is considered polluted when the composition of the water changes and it causes the water to be unusable. And in those cases, anything can pollute the water. Anything from fertilizers, pesticides, bacteria, viruses, phosphates, plastic, all of those things can pollute the water. And it's something that doesn't necessarily change the physical nature of the water. So it's something that you may not see. That's why it's important and that's part of my job, to ensure that water is sampled and tested to ensure the quality of the water. I mean, it affects the everyday person in many ways, from the water's being contaminated. With drinking water, we have many different types of drinking water in Kentucky. There's surface water that is treated. There's groundwater, which has to have some sort of treatment as well. Not as much as surface water, but then there's an unintended consequence to the disinfection that we put into the water to clean it so that it is safe. But those disinfectants causes byproducts, which also are linked to cancer and things like that. And that's what I do, monitor the levels of disinfectant byproducts of the water. So it's kind of like a double-edged sword. You know, we are here trying to treat the water. In turn, we're also causing harm to ourselves by treating the water with the pollutants that form inside of the disinfection process. So, yeah, and there are a lot of effects of polluted water as well as disinfected water, and both of those are diseases, cancer, things like that. But then you have waterborne illnesses, which is why we do want to disinfect the water, because that has more of a faster effect than the disinfectant byproducts, which is a long-term effect. So it's important for us to ensure the quality of the water.
Takoy, you went out for a second. We see you.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. It's important for us to all, because water isn't just viable for us, it's viable to all living things. My service. and go around.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it might be helpful if you turn off the camera so that your sound quality still picks up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, this is important because water pollution has a major impact on not just us, the everyday people, but all living things. The plant is viable for our planet. So it's very important for all of us to not just know the impacts of water pollution, but to also play a role in trying to stop the pollution. Everything that we put into the earth goes into the water in some form, some way. It goes right back into the ground, which is where the water is. So yeah, it's just it's a big thing. And I know in Kentucky, we actually have a lot of rural counties. So we have people that actually don't have access to city water where the water is clean and tested for you. So in those cases, these people may drink from a well, they may drink from a spring. I've even been out on a complaint from someone who received their water from a coal mine. So they actually have to get water from where they can get it. Yeah, and that the water from the coal mine was very acidic. I mean, it had a lot into it. So we would actually go out and test this water for free for the citizens of Kentucky. And we would kind of, let them know exactly what's in the water and give them a little bit of advice, which they're not required to follow, because if it's not a public water source, then we can't mandate any type of changes to that. But that still is a health hazard. Even if they don't want to take the advice or they don't want to do those things, it still can be a hazard to them. And all of these things can be linked to diseases and things like that. So the quality of life is impacted by this as well. So I just think it's really important to understand how to take care of our waters. Like it's like a baby. It's very important, and the earth we need it.
Yeah, so this is a great conversation. And to our viewers, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I can't drink water, the water ain't safe, right? We're going to get to what are some solutions, right? What can we do about it? We're not going to end this conversation without talking about what are some ways that we can do something about it, both personally, right? Like how can you protect yourself, but then also politically, right? Because this is a systemic issue that's going to take a collective effort, policy solutions. It's going to take administrative solutions, right? There's going to be a multitude of ways that we're going to have to work together to ensure that we can enhance the quality of our water and we can ward off some of these challenges that we're hearing about in terms of the impact. And so we're going to get to that before we leave. So hang on, don't stop drinking water. You need it to survive. But I want to have a conversation just quickly about how is this happening? Like, I want to know from you all experts who are doing this, and I'm sure there are viewers who want to know how did we get to this place where it is possible for so many chemicals to be in our water, so many harmful things to be run off into our water? How did we get to this place, and whose job is it to make sure this doesn't happen? I kind of know some of this, but I want to hear from you all. How did we get here, and whose job is it to do something about it? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Reuter, just to share a little bit. How did we get to this place? Like what led us here?
It's a great question, Robin. And again, I'm going to go back to in 1969. In 1969, the Cuyahoga River burned. That was actually the 13th time the river had burned, but it burned in June. And it was like, as a country, we were just fed up with this. We had giant harmful algal blooms that would cover about 2/3 of the western basin of Lake Erie. The western basin is that portion of the lake west of Sandusky, Ohio. So very large portion, and it would just be covered with a giant algae bloom. And 1 year after that river burned, we had the formation of US EPA, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and we celebrated the first Earth Day. A year after that, Canada came on board and they created their version of US EPA. That was in 71. And a year later, 1972, and this is an important date, 1972, in April, President Nixon and Premier Trudeau, the senior Trudeau at this point, the current Trudeau's father, signed the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And that allowed scientists to come together, look at the problem. We agreed that phosphorus is what's causing it. We set limits. We had to reduce the amount of phosphorus from 29,000 metric tons down to 11,000 metric tons. It's a lot of reduced phosphorus. But again, in those days, it was coming from poor sewage treatment. In October of 1972, we passed the Clean Water Act. This is Congress passed the Clean Water Act, and that was actually over President Nixon's veto. The Clean Water Act allowed us to regulate point sources of pollution. So pollution that was coming in from a pipe could be regulated. So we could regulate sewage treatment plants and make them do a better job. Congress also appropriated a lot of money because improving those sewage treatment plants was very expensive, but we did it. And so that was in the 1970s. By 1981, we hit our target for the phosphorus reduction. We went from 29,000 down to 11,000 tons. Lake became the walleye capital of the world. The weakness in the Clean Water Act is that it does not allow us to regulate non-point sources. And agricultural runoff is considered a non-point source.
Wow.
So we know that this is the problem, but we really, through the Clean Water Act, can't regulate that.
Wow. Wow. So one of our viewers had a interesting comment / question that I want to pose for you all. And then I want to continue this conversation about what's causing this, because I'm curious about agricultural runoff and like what's happening in that space. And I want to expand on that. But one of the viewers had a comment saying, I wonder to what extent the challenges concerning natural disposition of arsenic or sulfur deposits from the glaciers may still be impacting or causing a problem. So to what extent are those things from the glaciers, the arsenic and sulfur deposits from glaciers, still impacting or causing problems in our water quality?
It's a great question. And clearly coming from a knowledgeable person.
Yeah.
And when we think about people need to recognize, granite, for instance, is radioactive, and arsenic is in our background all around us, small quantities. Certain kinds of geologic deposits contain more arsenic than others. Same thing with sulfur. And so where you get your water, particularly if you're drilling for your water, groundwater, and one of the speakers was talking about drilling for groundwater, it's possible that you're going to get water that is tainted with some of those materials, and you're going to have to go through some kind of a process to try to remove that. In the case of harmful algal blooms and those toxins, it's possible for our water treatment plants to remove them. That's the good news. But it's expensive to do it. And typically the big problem here is that the problem is caused 100 miles from where the problem occurs. It's caused out on a farm somewhere, that runs into the river, goes down to the lake or to the city, which is typically located at the mouth of the river. That's where the harmful algal bloom occurs. The river carries all the manure from the farmer's field back down to the city. That's where the bloom occurs. So the people who are impacted are not the same people who caused it. And that's big challenge.
Yeah, and I think there's a few things in what you said, right? Like you shared the history, and I'm glad you did. And one of the things that I'm thinking about is like, we can't pass a legitimate, helpful spending infrastructure bill if we were, like, for the life of us now, it's impossible to get our legislators to all collaborate to do the things that we know we need to do, to fund the projects we know we need to fund, or even to expand what's regulated to account for the modern need, right? What was needed to be regulated in 1972 and what we need to regulate in 2022 aren't the same. And I can't imagine trying to get this through Congress today. And so that's one of the things that come up for me is like the role of government is to account for this stuff, right? And if we're not able to legislate these things when we need to give the agencies the power that they need to have to do the jobs that we need them to do to protect the population of people, there's some challenges in that. And so I appreciate you sharing that history, because that seems so ridiculously impossible to think about that much collaboration happening today. But I'm going to have some hope for the future. More is possible, and I think enough people want something to happen that eventually we're going to get there. We're just in a tough spot politically right now to get that level of collaboration. I also appreciate what you said about who's being impacted versus where the source is, right? And we know that there's so many political challenges with jurisdictions and going across interstate lines and who's regulating what. And, you know, if the people regulating in the states where it's happening or in the places where it's happening aren't seeing the impact, their urgency to support what needs to happen might not always be there. There's so many challenges with that. And so I appreciate you bringing that up. And I want to get to this point about impact too in this conversation. And so, Elena, I want to bring you into this conversation to hear a little bit about from your vantage point, and also Jasmine, I want to bring you in as well about this thing around agricultural runoff and what's happening with that, right? Because when I think about if there's pesticides and things flowing from agriculture into the water that's harmful, I'm like, what am I eating? Because that stuff started on the food, right? And so there's so many connections here that's important. So I want to talk a little bit about the communities that are being affected and what's happening with agricultural runoff, like what is actually running off, and what are the sources of these challenges. And so that was like 5 questions. Just pick whichever one feels resonant for you. Don't feel pressured to answer all of them. You all got me thinking about a lot of stuff. And so, Elena, I'm going to start with you, and then Jasmine, bring you in.
Sure. I've been thinking a lot about just how much it may answer one of these questions you mentioned, but it's on the top of my mind now, where if you think about the colonizer mindset in the United States, how much we work against nature, and how when we work against nature, we create a cascade effect of problems. And you can see that in both the work that I do with shoreline hardening, but also with agricultural runoff, because in the western part of Ohio, that used to be the Great Black Swamp, which some people may have heard. It was this, was this swamp forest that covered, I think it went all the way from the lake down toward Dayton, likely. It was a huge swath of land. And so it was naturally always like there was a high water table, it was often flooded, and it would, change with the changing lake dynamics. So like our water levels can vary year to year over several decadal cycles, et cetera. But when we started to basically drain the swamp to create farmland because the soil was so fertile, we're working against that because often those farm fields, what they put in are drainage tiles to help facilitate removal of water off of the farm fields, because they've built those farm fields in an area where the water table is naturally high and where the soils will naturally get flooded. And so when you build these drainage tiles, which essentially are just like pipes under the ground to facilitate water removal, so you're not flooding your crops. On a heavy rain day, say unfortunately a farmer might have put fertilizer on their land, and didn't realize, a massive rainstorm was coming. Sometimes we often can't predict the weather. And then all of that water goes through the drainage tiles into the nearest drainage channel, then into the nearest tributary, into Lake Erie. And so if we were to rethink, how we know that the landscape naturally responds in that way. It's swampland. It naturally likes to stay flooded and wet. Working with that versus against it. Similarly with the coastline, you think about how, it naturally used to be much more forested. So the watershed of Lake Erie is like 20% forested across its whole watershed cover. And in contrast, like Lake Michigan, Lake Huron are 41, 49% forested. Lake Superior is 91% forested. It's a much more, rural part of the Great Lakes. But when you think about removing all those trees from the landscape and even removing trees along the banks of rivers and not leaving room for what are called riparian forests or forests that like to be along rivers, then that sediment doesn't stay in place because there's no roots kind of keeping that sediment in place. And so when you have a massive rain event, all that sediment washes. And so it's, again, when we start to build in places where we should just let nature be, or we should at least be working with nature and not trying to force it to go another way, then we wouldn't be creating these cascading effects. We wouldn't have to be, treating our water with so many disinfectants and then we're then worried about disinfection byproducts. We wouldn't have to worry so much about sediment in the water, then keeping the water warmer longer and causing, water quality issues that way. So that's what comes to mind for me is really, I think, educating residents and communities and even just like cities, counties about like how we should craft our infrastructure projects or even the upgrades or maintenance of those projects to really reflect the ecosystem we're in and not to work against it. I'll leave you with that.
Yes, mic drop.
Yep.
Mic drop. Definitely.
I will also say I'm drinking water here. I live in Lakewood, which is near Cleveland. So I am drinking my water. It's all good.
Absolutely. Jasmine, I want to bring you in and we're going to get Jasmine, you and Takoya, and then we're going to have to wrap this up. And I want to specifically shift a little bit to ask you to, because we know the impact, right? Like there's a saying that when America gets the cold, Black folk get the flu, right? And we see this across every single category of outcomes. There is a disparate impact for Black and Brown communities on these issues. And so both of you are working in activism spaces around environmental justice, water quality, and things like that. And so I would love to have you all kind of wrap this conversation up a little bit with what are the implications for Black and Brown people? And then really quickly and just a round robin for all four panelists, end with what's one thing that folks can do to help support progress in this space. And so Jasmine and Takoya, what's the impact that you're noticing in your advocacy work around Black and Brown communities? And then everyone really quickly, one thing that people can do to move us toward progress in this space.
Yeah, I think the impact is, if you want my personal opinion, and I am not a scientist, I did try biochemistry, but I quickly changed to sociology and psychology because I know my lane. And with that being said, I'm grateful for the little bit of education I did have around it because it led me to understand the health implications. So Black people already are at risk for so many comorbidities: cardiovascular disease, cancer, mental health, emotional health. And so when you have water, which is our body filtration system, basically when you are composed at over a 90% composition rate of water, it really matters the quality of water that you put into you because it literally contributes to a filtration system. So a filtration system that is composed of things that your body naturally wants to get rid of gives you kidney issues over time. It gives you heart issues, right, over time. That leaching of the lead from those already harmful chemicals from the agricultural and the manufacturing runoff, because we must talk about that, because manufacturing is the reason why we are in this position in the first place. Manufacturing, economy, and money, right? It's the reason why the deforestation is at 41% at the Great Lakes versus 95 at Lake Superior, right? It's because of how we utilize the lake in the formation of when Ohio was started. So continuously, when we choose money over people, we will be put in positions where this continues to happen. When we choose money over nature, not understanding that nature will have its way, we know that these outcomes and the comorbidities will impact the people who live on the land and the other animals that live on the land when the literal earth doesn't function as it should. And so what you're really seeing is a compounding of health comorbidities, and we don't know where it comes from. Is it the goose or the egg, right? So when you already have oppression, when that oppression already leads to redlining, when that redlining already leads to lower air quality, lower food, not lower soil health, and then replacing water that is already contaminated on top of it, what you're doing is you're compounding, you're actually body slamming the crap out of comorbidities for people who already don't have the resources to be healed in the first place. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. And one thing you can do, I would say if you particularly live in Southwest Ohio, one of the things you can do is harass your municipality to give more money, and particularly your county commissioners, because that is who typically cleans your water. Harass them to expand the budget of water, because we need it for filtration, but also we need to have innovation where more things like biomimicry and people like that are hired at the municipal level to help us understand the natural habitats that we live in so that we can rehab them.
I'm a first lady, so my inclination was to say amen. That's what the people want. Thank you. Sequoia, jump in here.
I think that was really good, and I really agree. I would just like to add, I feel like the lack of knowledge is something that really affects us Black and brown people. I think automatically people think they go to a faucet, they turn on water, and it's safe and you can drink it, which 9 times out of 10 it is. We have people that buy bottled water, which bottled water is not regulated in every state. Kentucky does regulate bottled water, but a lot of times people will get a little confused, and they'll think like, oh, I'll go buy water. It's better than the water that I'm drinking. But drinking water is regulated federally nationwide, but bottled water isn't. It's not regulated federally, and there are some states that do not regulate it. So I think it's important for us to know what it is we're consuming for our health. I know that with Kentucky, I know this is federal as well, there are consumer confident reports that the water system where you purchase your water from, they're required to put out at least once a year. And it goes on the back of your bill, or it's kind of in your bill. And it's important to read those, because it's telling you exactly what's in your water. It's telling you all the violations the water system may have received, chemicals that have been tested for, and just knowing the effects of those chemicals and being very proactive and contacting your water system if you see something that is disturbing and getting more information. I believe knowledge is power, and it's important for us to not just turn a blind eye, but to really engage and get involved into what we are drinking, eating, and all of those things. And I honestly feel like that is the biggest roadblock for Black and brown people. It's just kind of like out of sight, out of mind. I can't see it, it's not there. But that's not true. So it's very important for us to pay attention to what people are selling us, what you're actually paying for, because you pay for this. So it's important for us.
We do.
Yeah, and it's pretty high. So it's definitely important for us to get involved with that. And as far as playing our part, I'm a big environmentalist. So littering, things like that, putting stuff into the earth, you don't want to put anything into the earth that you wouldn't put into your body. And that's how I look. So it's important to make sure that we are taking care of the earth like we would take care of ourselves or like we would take care of our children, because we want it to be a viable place for us and our children, grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren for years to come. So I think we are the biggest downfall for ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you, Takoya. Elena, what's one thing that folks can do to help push progress in this space?
Oh man, I have so many ideas, but
Okay,
you
can give two quick ones.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think anytime that you, if someone sees like a lake access or like green space being created really close to the lake, that's becoming more common, at least in Cleveland and East, like creating greater access to the lake, more green space, to always like, if you can, like advocate, for just like more trees, like breaking up that, shoreline hardening, increasing access to the lake so people can enjoy it and be there, and really just like spending more time at the lake and just really developing that relationship with, where your water comes from and your own home. So I think just advocating for just more people to be able to experience the lake in like a safe way. And just breaking up those concrete blocks, or like rebar sticking out sometimes, like steel rods, like that's not safe to walk around. And like by removing that increases people's capacity to enjoy our Great Lake, but also it helps with a lot of the other things I mentioned. It improves that land-water interface. So that's what I would say.
Thank you for that. Jeffrey? You're muted.
We've talked a little bit about the activism part of it. I think that's very important. Be sure to speak to your state representative, your state senator. Also speak to your congressperson and both senators. Let them know that safe drinking water is very important to you. A couple good groups to consider joining or getting involved with. I think the Environmental Law and Policy Center, that's a group out of Chicago, and the Ohio Environmental Council are two very good ones. I've done a lot of work, past chair of the board of the Nature Conservancy in Ohio. That's also a good one, a group that is trying to do good things here, and the kind of things that Elena was referring to. We can improve this by running our rivers or our creeks or our ditches through wetlands. That very much would be a help. And there's a lot of that going on by Ohio Department of Natural Resources right now. But I think the biggest thing from me is that we have to change the way we're doing our agriculture. And we have to recognize that food production is incredibly important. But we can do this without reducing food production. We have to keep food production high, but we have to improve our water quality. And the key for farmers is to not apply more fertilizer than is needed for maximum crop production. Many farmers are already doing that. They're doing the right things. But our current guidelines for animal operations allow them to apply more than 4 times the amount that is needed for maximum crop production. And it's a recipe to create the problems that we're seeing. And so if we could get farmers to apply no more than what is needed, that keeps agricultural production high, and it solves our water quality problem. That's really the key.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Just to recap for our viewers, some of the takeaways, if you're like me and you're like, oh shoot, what do I do? Right? Just some things that have been shared is really to harass, right? To really advocate and push on your county commissioners, which are the folks who are primarily funding water maintenance and filtration projects near you. And so really connect with your county commissioners and really make sure that they know that this this is a priority for you. Educating yourself on the water quality and source of water near you. Reading the back of your water bill, which I didn't even know that I should do that. And so I generally skim to the cost and say, oh, that's high, and disgruntledly pay it. And so now I'm going to actually read my water bill. Don't put nothing in the earth that you wouldn't put in your body. That is a mic drop right there. And now as I'm gardening and landscaping at my house, I'm like, what am I using? Why am I using it? Right? Is this necessary? Right? Advocate for more trees near waterfront spaces. Speak to your state senator, U.S. senators, and congressional folks, and let them know that this is a priority for you. Connect with organizations who are advocating for this. Dr. Reuter named a few, and I want to throw in the Black Environmental Leaders Association among those. Innovate on our agricultural processes and no more fertilizer than you need, right? And what I think also sums this up, and I want to add in there a call to action to vote, because there are elected officials named throughout all these things that have the power to influence how much funding is going where, what's being regulated, what's not being regulated, right? How we're supporting innovation and research opportunities for farmers who may not feel like they have the capacity and resources to deviate from their current process to innovate on their needs. And I know Ohio State has a wonderful agricultural program. And so there's so many opportunities for us to vote for people who align with these values. And so with that, I just want to say thank you to all of our panelists. You all are amazing, just absolutely brilliant individuals, and so grateful to be in this space with you. Thank you to all of our viewers for joining us for another Black Landscapes Matter conversation. Thank you to Common Strategies for coordinating this. And of course, thank you to the Black Environmental Leaders Association for all of the wonderful things that you are doing. We will see you all next month, the third Thursday of June, right here on these same platforms at 6 p.m.